Department of Politics, and I'm moderating a panel on the movement from protest to politics. And so I welcome you all this morning, and I'm happy that you're all here for the first panel of the day. What we're focusing on this morning is what Julian Bond's life and work tell us about the challenges of using state actors and the mechanisms of conventional politics in order to try to address concerns about social justice. We have three presenters this morning, and two of them are from law schools, and one is from an ethnic studies department. You can see their more complete biographies on the website for the symposium. So I won't go into more detail about, and also in the program. So, you can look at those write-ups there. What we're going to do today is first we will have an introduction from Kim Forde-Mazrui, who is from the University of Virginia Law School, and he will introduce us to some of what Julian Bond said about his own work. And we'll be watching a video for a short time. Next, after we finish the video, and that'll take about 15 minutes, then we'll hear from LaTasha Levy, who is from the University of Washington, and she's going to explore Julian Bond's campaign to win a seat in the Georgia State House of Representatives in 1965. And this is going to be a story about trying to introduce us to the tensions and challenges of introducing democratic practice into conventional electoral and party politics, and perhaps it might yield some lessons for today. So, after that, we're going to hear from Tim Lovelace, who is at the University of Indiana Law School. After Julian Bond won election to the Georgia State House, the other legislators in the House refused to seat him, and he had to struggle to get recognition of his own electoral victory. It was because he protested the Vietnam War, and there are other possible motives that Professor Lovelace is going to help us examine. So those are the that's what we have on the agenda. So without further ado, Kim Forde-Mazrui will introduce us to the video.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I was going to speak today about racial justice in law based on my new textbook, but when I saw the theme of the panel and the other presenters, it occurred to me that a more fitting presentation would be that of Julian Bond himself, who talked about the role of SNCC, the origins of SNCC, and its transition from protest to politics. So the talk was at a conference I held at the law school that Tim and I organized in 2010. And so I'm going to play two clips to help keep the time down. The whole thing is probably around 17 minutes. Before I start the two segments, though, let me also just take this opportunity to plug Tim Lovelace, and he is very much a protege of Julian Bond. In fact, the last time I saw Julian Bond, I was moderating a panel at the law school, and Tim was assisting me as usual as my assistant director of the Center for the Study of Race and Law. And Chairman Bond made a point of saying that Tim Lovelace is really a rising star in our profession, and he was quite prescient in that view. So I'm just.
I paid him to say that.
And Tim actually introduced Chairman Bond, but that didn't make the video clip at this conference. And Tim is thanked in the beginning of this casebook as well. So thank you for all you do, Tim. And but let's turn it over to Mr. Bond.
Now, my remarks are entitled, What We Did. I want to begin with a quotation from Ella Baker. She said, "Strong people don't need strong leaders. We were strong people. We did strong things." And I want to talk about some of the things we did. This began for me, as it did for many, many more. On February 4th, 1960, I was sitting in a cafe near my college campus in Atlanta, Georgia, a place where students went between or instead of classes. A student named Lonnie King approached me. He held up a copy of that day's Atlanta Daily World, Atlanta's daily black newspaper. The headline read, "Greensboro Students Sit In for Third Day." It told in exact detail how black college students from North Carolina A&T University in Greensboro had for the third day in a row entered a Woolworth's department store and asked for service at the whites-only lunch counter. It described their demeanor, their dress, their determination to return the following day, and as many successive days as it took if they were not served. "Have you seen this?" he demanded. "Yes, I have," I replied. "What do you think about it?" he asked. "I think it's great," I said. "Don't you think it ought to happen here?" he asked. I said, "I'm sure it will happen here. Surely someone here will do it." And then to me, as it came to others in those early days of 1960, a query, an invitation, and a command, he said, "Why don't we make it happen here?" And before I could say, "What do you mean we?" King, Joe Pierce, and I canvassed the cafe, talking to students, inviting them to discuss the Greensboro event and to duplicate it in Atlanta. The Atlanta student movement had begun. We formed an organization, we reconnoitered downtown lunch counters, and within a week, 77 of us had been arrested. In an early 1960s freedom song, the young people who joined together to create the Southern student movement were described in this way. You know, I debated with myself whether I should sing this. My wife said no. But I heard cries of yes. I sing this one verse. It goes, "The time was 1960, the place the USA. February 1st became the history-making day. From Greensboro across the land, the news spread far and wide, as quietly and bravely youth took a giant stride. Heed the call, Americans all, side by equal side. Brothers, sit in dignity, sisters, sit in pride, in pride, in pride." Yeah, that's enough. Yeah. As former President Jimmy Carter told Snick worker Mary King, if you wanted to scare white people in Southwest Georgia, Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian leadership wouldn't do it. You only had to say one word, Snick. As John F. Kennedy said, compared to Martin Luther King's SCLC, Snick workers were real sons of bitches. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was founded in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1960 by Southern student protesters engaged in sit-in demonstrations against lunch counter segregation. Within a year, the organization evolved from a coordinating committee to a hands-on organization, helping local leadership in rural and small-town communities across the South, helping them participate in a variety of protests and political and economic organizing campaigns, setting SNCC apart from the civil rights mainstream of the 1960s. Its members, its youth, its independence enabled the organization to remain close to grassroots currents that rapidly escalated the Southern movement from sit-ins to freedom rides to voter drives to political organizing. By 1965, SNCC fielded the largest staff of any civil rights organization operating in the South. It had organized nonviolent direct action against segregated facilities and voter registration projects in Alabama, Arkansas, Maryland, Missouri, Louisiana, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Illinois, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Texas, and Mississippi. It had built 2 independent political parties. It had organized labor unions and agricultural co-ops. It gave the movement for women's liberation new energy. It inspired and trained the activists who began the New Left. It helped expand the limits of political debate within Black America, and it broadened the focus of the civil rights movement. Unlike mainstream groups, which merely sought integration of blacks into the existing order, SNCC sought structural changes in American society itself. In 1960, the dominant organization fighting for civil rights was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Its preferred method was litigation, and it achieved its greatest victory in 1954 in Brown v. the Board of Education. The NAACP lobbied Congress and presidents to adopt anti-segregation measures. Its local branches were often the main civil rights outpost in many communities. The NAACP and many similar groups and many individuals fought against a tripartite system of racial domination which whites had solidified over time. Ironically, a consequence of the segregation system was the development of close-knit communities, communities of institutions, churches, schools, and organizations, which nurtured and encouraged the fight against white supremacy. The young people who began the 1960 Student Senate movement lived and learned among such institutions. The movement's goals were described to the Democratic Convention's Platform Committee in 1960 by SNCC's first chairman, Marion Barry, as seeking a community in which man can realize the full meaning of self, which demands open relationships with others. He declared Southern students wanted an end to racial discrimination in housing, education, employment, and voting. SNCC's goals were similarly broadly described by Executive Secretary James Forman in 1961 as working full-time against the whole value system of the country and by working toward revolution. In 1963, he described as a program of developing, building, and strengthening indigenous leadership, and by third SNCC Chairman John Lewis at the 1963 March on Washington as building a serious social revolution against American politics dominated by politicians who build their careers on immoral compromises and ally themselves with open forms of political, economic, and social exploitation. SNCC pioneered first-time races by blacks in the 1960s Deep South, added foreign policy demands to the black political agenda, and broadened the acceptable limits of political discourse. SNCC was in the vanguard in demonstrating that independent black politics could be successful. Its early attempts to use black candidates to raise issues where victory was unlikely expanded the political horizon. SNCC's development of independent political parties mirrored the philosophy that political form must follow function and that non-hierarchical organizations were essential to counter the growth of personality cults and self-reinforcing leadership. For much of its early history, SNCC battled against the fear which kept Southern rural blacks from aggressively organizing and acting in their own behalf. It strengthened or built aggressive, locally led movements in the communities where it worked. While organizing grassroots voter registration drives, SNCC workers offered themselves as a protective barrier between private and state-sponsored terror and the local communities where they lived and worked. The rural South SNCC entered in 1961 had a long history of civil rights activism. In many instances, however, SNCC staffers were the first paid civil rights workers to base themselves in isolated rural communities, daring, as it was reported then, to take the message of freedom into areas where the bigger civil rights organizations feared to tread. SNCC workers were more numerous and less transient than those from other civil rights organizations, and their method of organization was different as well. The NAACP was outlawed in Alabama in 1956 and did not begin operating there again until 1964, although NAACP activists continued under other sponsorship. In 1962, the NAACP had one field secretary each in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, and a regional staff headquartered in Atlanta. One historian writes, SCLC had to adopt a strategy of hit and run, striking one target at a time. SCLC's willingness to run as well as to hit provoked consistent criticism from SNCC, which organized the same communities for years rather than months or weeks. SNCC mobilized, someone said. SNCC organized. By spring of 1963, SNCC had 11 staff members in southwest Georgia and 20 staff with 6 offices in Mississippi. By August, SNCC had projects and a permanent staff in a dozen Mississippi communities in Selma, Alabama, Danville, Virginia, and Pine Bluff, Arkansas. There were 12 workers in the Atlanta headquarters, 60 field secretaries, and 121 full-time volunteers. Typically, SNCC began campaigns by researching the economic and political history of a target community. Field workers were supplied with detailed information on a community's economic and financial power structure, tracing corporate relations from local bankers and business leadership in a local white citizen council to the largest American banks and corporations. Other research provided the economic and political status of a state's black population. SNCC organizers spent their first weeks in a new community meeting local leadership, formulating with them an action plan for more aggressive registration efforts, and recruiting new activists through informal conversation, painstaking house-to-house canvassing, and regular mass meetings. Registering rural Southern blacks, a Snick worker wrote, would greatly liberate American politics as a whole. At the very least, these new voters would defeat the powerful, hidebound Southern Democrats who were holding the reins of Congress and the Senate on the basis of being elected year after year from districts where black citizens were denied the franchise. Snick and other organizations fought white terror and helped create a willingness to risk danger to register to vote. By one estimate, a majority of the unregistered had at least been confronted with registration's challenge by 1965. Snick's broader definition of the civil rights movement's purposes was obvious from its beginnings. At its founding conference in April 1960, Snick Executive Committee member Charles Jones declared, "This movement will affect other areas beyond lunch counter services, such as politics and economics." A report from the founding conference concluded with a warning about America's false preoccupations in early 1960. In Los Angeles, Snick worker Cliff Vause described his work as a manifestation of self-help, determination, and power for poor people. Just as a concern for social change had never been limited to the southern states alone, Snick's concern for human rights had long extended beyond the borders of the United States. It had linked the fight of American blacks with the struggle for African independence from its very first public statements. At its founding statements, it announced its identification with the African liberation struggle. It said, "We identify ourselves with the African struggle as a concern for all mankind." At their fall 1960 conference in Atlanta, a featured speaker was Alfonso Cuckoo, an Antioch College student and brother of Kenyan labor leader Tom Mboya. The mass meeting program said, "Okuku brings to our attention the great significance of the African struggle and its relationship to our fight." Snick chairman John Lewis told the March on Washington in 1963, "One man, one vote is the African cry. It must be ours." In December 1963, Snick workers in Atlanta conferred with Kenya leader Oginga Odinga, and in September 1964, an 11-member Snick delegation went to Guinea as guest of that country's president, Sekou Touré. 2 members of the group toured Africa for a month after the Guinea trip. In October 1965, 2 Snick workers represented the organization at the annual meeting of the Organization of African Unity in Ghana. Snick's January 1966 anti-war statement charged the United States with being deceptive in claiming control for freedom of colored people in such countries as the Dominican Republic, the Congo, South Africa, and the United States itself. Singer Harry Belafonte organized a supportive reception at the United Nations with 15 African diplomats in early 1966. And in March 22, 1966, 7 Snick workers were arrested at the South African consulate in New York City, preceding by 20 years the Free South Africa movement that later saw hundreds arrested at the South African embassy in Washington. At a June 1967 staff meeting, Snick declared itself a human rights organization, dedicated to the liberation not only of black people in the United States, but of all oppressed people, especially those in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Snick's chair, Stokely Carmichael, visited Algeria, Syria, Egypt, Guinea, and Tanzania in mid-67. In November 67, Foreman testified for Snick before the UN's 4th Committee against American investment in South Africa. There are many, many reasons for the demise of this important organization. The current of nationalism, ever present in black America, widened at the end of the 1960s to become a rushing torrent which swept away the hopeful notion of black and white together that the decade's beginning had promised. Snick's white staff members were asked to devote their energies to organizing in white communities. Some agreed, but many believed this action repudiated the movement's hopeful call to Americans all side by equal side. For many on the staff, both white and black, nearly a decade's worth of hard work at a regular subsistence level pay, under an atmosphere of constant terror, interrupted by jailings, beatings, and official and private terror, proved to be too much. When measured by the legislative accomplishments of the 1964 Civil Rights and 1965 Voting Rights Act, Snick's efforts were successful. But the failure of the Mississippi Democratic Party to gain recognition in Atlantic City predicted the coming collapse of support from white liberals. The murders of 4 schoolgirls in Birmingham, Medgar in Jackson in 1963, civil rights workers and others in Mississippi in 1964, Martin Luther King in 1968, argued that nonviolence was no antidote to a violent society. The outbreak of urban violence at the decade's end further produced a sense of frustration and alienation in many SNCC veterans. Throughout its brief history, SNCC insisted on group-centered leadership and community-based politics. It made clear the connection between economic power and racial oppression. It refused to define racism as solely Southern, to describe racial inequality as caused by rational prejudice alone, or to limit the struggle solely to guaranteeing legal equality. It challenged American imperialism while mainstream civil rights organizations were silent or curried favor with President Johnson, condemning SNCC's linkage of domestic poverty and racism with overseas adventurism. SNCC refused to apply political tests to its membership or supporters, opposing the red baiting which other organizations and leaders endorsed or condoned. It created an atmosphere of expectation and anticipation among the people with whom it worked, trusting them to make decisions about their own lives. It widened the definition of politics beyond campaigns and elections. For SNCC, politics encompassed not only electoral races, but also organizing political parties, labor unions, producer co-ops, and alternative schools. It initially sought to liberalize Southern politics by organizing and enfranchising blacks. One proof of its success was the increase in black elected officials in the Southern states from 72 in 1965 to 388 in 1968. But it also sought to liberalize the ends of political participation by enlarging the issues of political debate to include the economic and foreign policy concerns of American blacks. SNCC's articulation and advocacy of black power redefined the relationship between black Americans and white power. No longer would political equity be considered a privilege, it had become a right. One Snick legacy is the destruction of the psychological shackles, which had kept black Southerners in physical and mental peonage. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee helped to break these chains forever. It demonstrated that ordinary women and men, young and old, could perform extraordinary tasks. They did so then and can do so again. What began 50 years ago is not just history. It was part of a mighty movement that started many years before that and continues on to this day. Ordinary women, ordinary men, proving they can perform extraordinary tasks in the pursuit of freedom. Thank you.
I added this picture here from last night because Deborah McDowell mentioned that there was a photograph of Julian Bond with Paul Robeson, and so I found it. And so you can see this precious child here. Negro voters in big cities have realized for years that present-day politics is a failure for them. Present-day politics has done more than allow conditions to worsen for Negroes. It has, in fact, encouraged a worsening while telling Negroes and the nation things we don't need to hear. We don't need to know, for instance, that all of the voters of Massachusetts have elected a Negro senator. What we need to know is that nearly 100,000 Negro Mississippians in 1968 are without jobs, income, food, clothing, and shelter. We don't need to know that Alabama has elected a fine Negro sheriff, but we do need to remember that Alabama's white-faced version of Beulah and Tim still ruled that state. We don't need to know that Negroes can sleep where they never slept, eat where they never ate, and sit in the front of buses that never even used to stop. We do need to know we still can't work where we can now sleep. We can't pay the bill at some of the places we are now allowed to eat in. And we can't get a union job in the factory that makes the bus that we are now able to sit in the front of. We all need to know that as the number of Negro office holders increases, so does the number of Negro jobless. We do need to know as Negroes add their names to the registration list in the South, their names are struck from the list of those eligible for a job, a house, an education, or simple welfare relief. We do need to know while Black America slides down a hill that white America is climbing fast, the government of the richest and most powerful nation on earth cannot give the time, money, willingness, or energy to discover a solution to its most pressing problem. Without conducting a survey, one may be sure that Negroes are not poor and jobless because their family life is in disrepair. That theory is simply the co-opting of a favorite street corner game, The Dozens. It requires an answer in kind. We are not poor because of our mamas, but because of their mamas and papas who played the Dozens with us for over 300 years. What can the future hold for us if we choose to attack our problems with political means? These are the words of Julian Bond, an excerpt of a speech he gave before students, faculty, and community members at Tulane University in May of 1968. He was 28 years old, and on the heels of legislative victories with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Julian Bond was so incisive in understanding that these small victories were not the prize, and that the struggle against white supremacy and capitalist exploitation must continue on. This excerpt reminds me of Amilcar Cabral, who warned, "Tell no lies, claim no easy victories." I want to use this occasion to remember and pay homage to Julian Bond, the politician, the people's representative. As an elected official, Julian Bond advocated a radical democratic vision of black politics, but Bond's vision was not his alone. His boldness, his keen understanding of the entanglements of racism, class exploitation, and militarism, and his faith in the power of ordinary folks to model the absolute best of American democracy were an extension and perhaps the fruits of the labor of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We see the practice of SNCC's radical democratic vision in the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project and its parallel institutions, the Freedom Schools and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. We see SNCC's vision in the organization of the Loudoun County Freedom Organization Party in Alabama, the original Black Panther Party. But we also see the workings of SNCC and Julian Bond's campaigns for political office that began in 1965 when he was elected to serve in the Georgia House of Representatives. And you've heard a little bit about this yesterday from Judy Richardson, and I'm sure Tim Lovelace will go into greater detail, so I'll spare some of those details for the sake of time. But it's important to note that year in 1965, 11 African Americans, 10 men, 1 woman, were elected to serve in the House, but only Bond was barred from taking his seat. And many of you may recall this iconic photo. The Georgia House of Representatives, governed by white segregationists, voted 182-12 to reject the will of the voters and deny Bond entry into the House. He was charged with misconduct after supporting a statement issued by SNCC which condemned the war in Vietnam. In an appeal to the federal district court, Bond's attorneys declared, quote, "Had a member of the Ku Klux Klan or the John Birch Society or the White Citizens Council spoken against federal policy, he would have been cheered." In an interview with Meet the Press, Bond responded that he certainly believed race was a factor in the House's refusal to see him, but he didn't think race was the sole factor. It was his employment with SNCC that was a problem. In other words, it was his politics that made him unacceptable. One article in The Nation captures the dilemma. It reads, quote, "Julian Bond, a 26-year-old Georgia-born poet, is talented enough to have his work in 6 anthologies, handsome enough to have been an advertising model, and politically popular enough to have been elected to the Georgia House of Representatives last fall at 82% of the voters in the Atlanta district. But Julian Bond is also the epitome of Southern white fears about the impact of the U.S. Supreme Court's one-man, one-vote decision. For he is a Negro and one of the founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the most militant of civil rights groups," end quote. So yes, this was about race, but Bond, because of his politics, posed a threat to the institution itself. He recognized that white Georgians wanted black politicians that, quote, "they can control." Interestingly enough, although Bond could not take his seat in the House, it was not his first time occupying space there. In 1962, Julian Bond and Ben Brown, the executive secretary of the Atlanta NAACP, were ousted from the House gallery for sitting in the whites-only section. And a white legislator screamed to the guards, "Get those niggas out of the white section of the gallery." 3 years later, they were both elected to take office as House representatives. In a way, they literally traveled the path from protest to politics. At the same time, the Bond campaign demonstrated the fallacy of this phrase, "from protest to politics." Protest is politics. Undoubtedly, politics needs protests. Always, Bond emphasized we must utilize both protests and politics to control our destinies. What was special about Bond's campaign, indicative of SNCC's political philosophy, was that ordinary black folks, black women, the youth, workers, the uneducated, the unemployed, it was these people who understood the problems they were facing, and it was these people who would craft the most valuable solutions to their own problems. Bond was the only candidate whose platform was written basically by the people of the 136th district. For the first time, residents were asked to express what they think, to share what they believe were the problems and possible solutions. His seat will be your seat, the brochure reads. What you want is the first plank of my platform. And he promised to visit every block in the district and talk to anyone he could find about what residents wanted to see from their representative. Bond told reporters, quote, "I'm going to speak in people's houses, barns, pool rooms, and anywhere people would listen to me." And he did. His platform included working for a $2 minimum wage law in Georgia covering all workers, including restaurant and domestic workers, the repeal of the right to work law that restricts labor unions from operating in the state, and despite the play on words, the brochure noted it is not a right law, and by restricting labor unions, it keeps wages low and working conditions poor. He advocated for the abolition of the death penalty, the only candidate to do so, removing all voting requirements except resident and age, liberalizing the urban renewal program to protect people who cannot afford the high costs of remodeling or moving, improving the state's public education, and fully representing all of the people of the 136th district. Bond campaigned on a, quote, platform and program of real representation. He wrote, "I believe now as I did then that the people must decide what their representatives must do." Can you imagine that? Snick members worked every morning distributing thousands of leaflets to workers, urging them to fight for their vote when the House refused Bond his seat. I wanted to show you a couple of images of a Snick flyer. Maybe Judy Richardson was the artist here. You can't really see it well enough, but they're in, this is an image of his face, kind of, you know. But here at the bottom it says, "Let us remember that Negroes have died for the right to vote in Georgia. They are now saying, what good does it do to get the right to vote to elect representatives only if those elected must face attitude tests or loyalty oaths?" I'm sorry, wrong way. Here's another one. Which side are you on? And you're familiar with the Freedom Song, which side are you on? And you have here at the top the American flag, the Confederate flag. We now know there's not much distinction between the two. But again, saying, do you deny the First Amendment, or will you fight to extend it to all citizens? Notably, Bond ran his campaign on the promise of change. Not change in hope like the Obama campaign, but change in action, change in power. And unlike Barack Obama, Bond was not the change. He was an advocate for change and systemic change. He wrote to his constituents, quote, "I make no promises to anyone about changing the world, but I do want you to know that I'm committed to working for real changes that will make a better life for all of us. Change is coming across the South. The old order is disappearing, and younger, newer ideas are taking hold. You can bring this change. The race is your race. This race is your race. The language of change empowered the people to see themselves as the agents of change, rather than framing Bond himself as the change and as their hope. It ain't no hoping and wishing." Now we know that Obama that Obama stole the change theme from Bond. He liked to take credit for stuff like that, stuff that you don't really know is true. You know, he would take credit of, this is the story he would always say that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said he had a nightmare. He told him, no, you didn't, you had a dream, you know. And so I want to give Julian Bond credit for the change theme in Barack Obama's campaign. At any rate, Bond's radical politics, rooted in the grassroots, inspired folks from all over the nation. His campaigns, his leadership in politics are critical for understanding Black power. Bond was a Black power advocate. The quote I shared with you at the opening of my remarks are a representation of his conception of Black power. Bond was Black power in action, he was Black power in politics, and his contributions to Black power are understudied and grossly overlooked. Bond emphasized over and over that Black women, Black youth, and Black workers and the poor are vitally important to the movement for Black liberation, and he argued the need for Black solidarity, for Black consciousness, coalition politics with other minorities such as Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and American Indians. He even stated, quote, "If we can get some kind of response, any kind of response from the heavy shield of racism that blinds poor white people, they would be our natural allies too." Bond's militancy inspired social movement activists all over, and at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, which was embroiled in controversy stemming from police riots that had injured thousands of anti-war protesters, the Wisconsin delegation nominated Julian Bond for vice president. Bond didn't meet the age qualification and eventually withdrew his name, but it was a symbolic nomination to draw national and international attention to poverty, racism, and war, 3 issues Bond said had been left out of discussions at the DNC. Here are just a couple of other flyers. This is for the 1972 Democratic Convention, where he's trying to drum up elections to be a delegate there. This is a campaign, not that he's sleeping on the job, but that he's working so much and he's tired, we have to support him. This is a flyer for a brochure for his run for state senate, where it says, "Vote for a man you know will vote for you." And these are some of the images I've seen from the 1970s. When Julian Bond was 35, he had the aspirations to run for president of the United States. He told a reporter, quote, "I have won every election that I have conducted since 1966, and I wouldn't run for the presidency to lose." Although he conceded that being black with little financial backing were barriers, he was proud of the fact that a Gallup poll had ranked him number 7 among preferred presidential candidates, and that the other 6 were former presidential candidates. And this wasn't 7 out of 10, this was 7 out of like 30. While Bond intended to run as a Democrat, he shared with the audience his interest in a third political party. Questions loomed as to whether a black man could be a serious contender for the presidency, and he stated, "I'm going to try and find out." Even if Bond could not win the presidential race, this intention was to launch a campaign that would play the role as broker during the delegation. In seeking out delegate votes, Bond could make a case for potential nominees to force the convention to deal more seriously with the economic and social concerns of blacks, to organize black and white liberal constituencies to resist compromises with George Wallace, and to force the convention to consider Bond and his views when choosing its candidates for president and vice president. So Bond was strategic. The fact of the matter is that campaigns need money, volunteers were put in work, making ends meet with no ends, and always witty. This next brochure shows you the selling of a candidate. And this is hard to see, but you know, I don't know that they actually had a pack of cigarettes with Julian Bond's face on it. But let me see if I can do it here. Part of what it says, now it's kind of small on my screen too, but it says your contribution will not be used to rig elections or buy beachfront property in Florida or California or to bribe foreign heads of states. It will be used to maintain the office, to buy paper for the secretary to type on. And then the fine print at the very bottom down here, it says that you can actually go to the Secretary of State's office and look at the list of contributors and campaign expenditures. So they were trying to be transparent as well. It also states that James Bond is the photographer and that labor was donated. Okay. Bond did not successfully run for the U.S. presidency, but he served in both the Georgia House and Senate for a combined 20 years. And those early campaigns are extraordinary cases in the studies of black politics, of black power, of participatory democracy, and Snick's radical democratic vision. And he teaches us and pushes us to consider what can the future hold for us if we choose to attack our problems with political means. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much to the Woodson Institute and all of the other co-sponsors of this really momentous occasion. We come here today in a bittersweet kind of moment. In the fall of 2002, Professor of History and Chairman of the NAACP, Julian Bond, stood on the steps of the rotunda before 300 protesters as part of a rally entitled "Dissent is Patriotic." News coverage from that day noted that speakers at the Gathering for Peace, quote, talked about the cost of war in both human and economic terms and questioned the motives for launching an attack on Iraq. Folding tables along the sides of the lawn bore petitions and anti-war literature. Several in the crowd wore white armbands and carried signs with slogans saying, "No war equals no body bags." Professor Bond, in his velvet voice, patient but firm tone, and ever-present cool. Professor Bond was cool, y'all. He did. He spoke of the NAACP's opposition to U.S. unilateral action in Iraq and insisted that the government work through the United Nations. He also urged the rally's attendees that they must remember that, quote, opposition was their duty. And he reminded us students that dissent could indeed be patriotic. But some students that day, as many had done more than 30 years earlier, asked, what business did a civil rights activist have in talking about issues of war? They didn't know Professor Bond's story. There were several of us who had taken this course on the history of the civil rights movement, or others who knew about Professor Bond's descent from another war in 1966. We told the story of a young activist and legislator who had the courage to dissent from the Vietnam War and in the process became the conscience of the nation. On that fall day, I began to tell Professor Bond's story, and I haven't stopped telling that story since. In 1966, after the Georgia House of Representatives denied Julian Bond his seat for his opposition to the Vietnam War, and a federal court upheld the Georgia House's decision, Bond appealed his case to the U.S. Supreme Court. And while there were many legal issues raised on appeal, the archival record left by Benno Schmidt Jr., then a clerk for Chief Justice Earl Warren, and the person who wrote the bench memo that served as the basis for the Bond v. Floyd opinion, offers us fresh understandings of the case. Schmidt, who would later become the dean of Columbia Law School and the president of Yale University, revealed the two reasons why Chief Justice Warren wanted to take the Bond case. The first reason was race. Bond had been at the forefront of the Atlanta student movement. He had been the communications director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he had led protests at the state capitol building, protesting many of the legislators who would later unseat him. And so in London and Paris, Kampala and Kingston, Accra, Lagos, Addis, international news outlets were covering the story of this Black internationalist from the U.S. South who was preaching nonviolence at home and nonviolence abroad. Even UN delegates from 15 African nations held a reception in Bond's honor. And there you have event co-organizer Harry Belafonte with Bayard Rustin, with James Foreman, with Dr. Martin Luther King, shaming Georgia on the global stage and talking about this moment being, quote, a creative coalition between the Black people of the US and our Black brothers in Africa. Schmidt, the Chief Justice's clerk, disclosed that Earl Warren, quote, had no illusion about what was going on in the Georgia legislature. It was his view that this exclusion of Bond was because of his association with Snick and what Snick stood for. Even back before Stokely Carmichael took it over, Schmidt added, Snick was pretty controversial, to say the least, in the South. And so I think that the chief viewed the rationale the state offered as kind of a series of afterthoughts, when their real motivation was racial and political in the broad sense. They didn't like Julian Bond's politics. The second reason why Chief Justice Warren wanted the Supreme Court to take Bond v. Floyd was because the case raised a novel question of judicial review of legislative exclusion. This legal issue is what's called entering the political thicket, or the doctrine of political questions. Bond v. Floyd was the first time that the US Supreme Court had ever considered whether a legislative body could deny a duly elected representative membership. Schmidt remembered that these, quote, special factors of importance about the case led the Chief Justice to assign the writing of the majority opinion to himself. He maintained, quote, I think he felt that if the court was going to get out on some frontier area, it was best to have the Chief Justice writing for the court. And my guess is that all along, as soon as he read the briefs in the case and saw what the case was about, he would be eventually writing the majority opinion. But although the Chief Justice was eager to accept the case and write the majority opinion, Warren did not want to wage a public war over the use of race and the unseating of Bond. The Warren court had been wrestling with racial backlash in desegregation and in the doctrine of political questions for years. And while the case had clear racial overtones, the court expressly declined to examine issues of race, declaring that it could dispose of the case on other constitutional grounds. Schmidt then narrowed the scope of the case tremendously, shaping the contours of the court's ultimate decision. Schmidt wrote, quote, despite all of the issues involved in the case, I think the determinative questions are two: whether a legislature can require a member a standard of loyalty to the Constitution and laws higher than the standard of loyalty which is required of the ordinary citizen, And if the answer to this first question is no, whether Bond's statements were protected by the First Amendment. Schmidt continued, quote, while a legislator can obviously make certain things a qualification for office, I do not think that this should apply to statements about public issues. The Georgia legislature cannot demand more in the way of political loyalty from its members than the state and country can demand from ordinary citizens. Schmidt also suggested that the Warren Court reverse the district court's opinion pursuant to the First Amendment. He wrote, quote, the rule announced should be that a state legislature may not disqualify a member for statements when there was no immediate danger of a violation stemming from speech. Bond had not urged anyone to burn their draft cards, and he had not been prosecuted for aiding individuals' violations of the Selective Service laws. The First Amendment, Schmidt concluded, would, quote, protect his statements because they did not involve danger that violence would replace free debate. Schmidt's analysis resonated with the Chief Justice, but Warren went much further than Schmidt's bench memos. Warren reversed the order of Schmidt's initial questions, placing the First Amendment at the center of the court's opinion, asking, quote, whether Bond's qualification because of his statements violated the free speech provisions of the First Amendment as applied to the states through the 14th Amendment. For Warren, the Georgia legislature's disqualification of Bond had indeed violated Bond's right to the freedom of expression. Warren declared, quote, the manifest function of the First Amendment in a representative government requires that legislators be given the widest latitude to express their views on issues of policy. The central commitment of the First Amendment, as summarized in the opinion of the court in New York Times v. Sullivan, Dr. King's most famous Supreme Court case, is that, quote, debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. Statements criticizing public policy and the implementation of it, the court held, are necessary to legislate. The interest of the public in hearing all sides of a public issue is hardly advanced by extending more protection to citizen critics than to legislators. Legislators have an obligation to take positions on controversial political questions so that their constituents can be fully informed by them and be better able to assess their qualifications for office, also so that they may be represented in governmental debates by the person they have elected to represent them. Warren's opinion also addressed the issue of loyalty that his clerk Schmidt had raised. But again, Warren's line of reasoning went well beyond Schmidt's bench memo. Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution requires that legislators be loyal to the U.S. Constitution as a condition of office. Chief Justice Warren ruled that Georgia's requirement that legislators pledge their loyalty to the country pursuant to Article 6 was, quote, constitutional yet improperly applied here. Such a power, the court held, could be utilized to restrict the right of legislators to dissent from national or state policy, or that of a majority of their colleagues under the guise of judging loyalty to the Constitution. The state of Georgia had selectively enforced the Article 6 power. Professor Bond's accusers had devised an improper litmus test for loyalty. They had been prosecutor, judge, and jury, all in violation of the U.S. Constitution. And so while Earl Warren waxed eloquent about Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, privately, Schmidt revealed the fact that these men raised the very concept of loyalty to the U.S. Constitution as an issue in Bond's seating, quote, triggered a real reaction in the Chief Justice. Many of Bond's accusers were the faces of massive resistance. In the wake of the Warren Court's landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education, the Georgia legislature claimed that the highest court in the land lacked legal authority to desegregate public schools. State legislators passed laws prohibiting the coeducation of blacks and whites and cutting off state funds to public schools if they ever attempted to desegregate. And in the 1960s, some Georgia legislatures attempted to stonewall desegregation at the University of Georgia. State legislators who had opposed the U.S. Supreme Court's rulings on desegregation not only took their seats without challenge in 1966, but they also voted to deny Bond his seat in the state legislature. The deep ironies. The associate justices on the court were nonetheless very pleased by Earl Warren's opinion. Draft Supreme Court opinions often require extensive revisions and can draw sharp exchanges between the justices, but the archival records show none of this. The conference files on the case contain pleasant notes between the justices, offering almost no editorial suggestions. The associate justices complimented the chief for authoring, quote, a fine opinion, and the decision in Bond v. Floyd was unanimous, 9-0. The Supreme Court had vindicated Professor Bond's courageous stance. In the fall of 2014, Professor Bond visited Indiana University, and he talked at the law school where I teach, giving a speech as part of a year-long speaker series on the civil rights movement. Hundreds of students, staff, and faculty members packed the cushioned auditorium chairs in the law school's moot courtroom. With all the chairs filled and standing room exhausted, the law school opened up an adjacent overflow room to stream Professor Bond's lecture to those who couldn't fit inside. But the overflow room overflowed. It was the largest event that our law school had hosted in more than a decade. After Professor Bond's wonderful lecture, one of the students from my advanced constitutional law class on social movements walked up to Professor Bond and his lovely wife and life's partner, Pam Horowitz. My student told them how much Professor Bond had inspired her and how much she enjoyed his lecture. The student added, "I see where Professor Lovelace gets all of his lectures from." You, Professor Bond. She was right, and I was honored. The movement stories I told in class, my emphasis on teaching students to raise critical questions on issues of law and public policy, whether those questions were popular or not, and my emphasis on reminding students that people their age and younger, most of which had no formal legal training, had transformed constitutional law by making constitutional claims in courts, in legislatures, and at lunch counters. Those lessons I learned from studying and watching Professor Bond. And for that, and the precious moments he shared with me as a humanist, as a scholar, and as an activist, I will forever be indebted. Thank you, Professor Bond. May you rest in power.
I want to thank the panelists for keeping to the time limit. It was perfect timing. So we have about 15 minutes to hear from the audience, and I have a set of questions that I can resort to if we don't hear from you all out in the audience, but I suspect that there's some questions already ready to go. So, yes, sir. Could you stand up and introduce yourself? Yeah.
Just a curious question that Muhammad Ali
I have no idea. If anyone answered that, the question was.
The question was about, yeah, go ahead. The question was about Muhammad Ali.
Oh, yes, well, I'm so glad you asked. One of Julian's most precious memories was he refereed a fight between Muhammad Ali and Maynard Jackson, who was then the mayor of Atlanta. And obviously, it was a charity thing, but they were going at it, and there are great pictures of this. And they can even be accessed online. Yes, me too. And at one point, Muhammad Ali said to Jackson, hit me. And Julian always told the story about Jackson's eyes got bigger and bigger, and he knew that he didn't want to hit him. He hit him. And then Ali hit the deck, and Julian always said he gave him a slow count. Jackson won the fight. They had been together they were not intimate friends, but they had met before that and I think after. And in fact, I went to the Muhammad Ali Museum in Louisville just in October, well, I guess a year ago, right after Julian had died, and it had been arranged for a friend and me to have a tour, and I got a text from Muhammad Ali while I was there, so I was a proud moment for me. So thank you, Tom.
Other questions?
Hi. Hi. My name is Julian Bond, and I have a question about, you all mentioned Julian Bond was working to make Georgia, it was currently a right-to-work state, and he was trying to change that aspect of being a right-to-work state. My question is, was he ever successful in changing that? Because I am from Atlanta, and I know as it stands right now, it is a right-to-work state. And so my question is, I know history can sometimes repeat itself. Was he ever successful in that, and then did it come back to being where it is now to be a right-to-work state? Or is there something that we can do currently to continue that path towards bringing Georgia to being a union state? Because in places like Atlanta, and I think the Southeast in general, the minimum wage is probably the lowest in the entire country. And, you know, people will argue that the cost of living is less. However, in places like Atlanta, in places probably like a Charlotte, North Carolina, and other major cities in the South, the cost of living is actually increasing, yet wages are not. And so I was just wondering if anyone had any suggestions or ideas as far as how to continue to work towards changing Georgia from being a right-to-work state.
Well, I just wanted to say, I mean, I haven't, this was just research that I've done over the summer here at Special Collections, because I was interested in just, you know, in the presidential season to revisit these campaigns. But the one thing that struck me is that he was speaking to issues at that time that are so critically important today with right to work. He was doing work around prisons. He had one brochure that, you know, talked about how they were visiting a prison where the prisoners themselves were creating a rehabilitation program, and the people want to send books to them because they're building their own library. He's talking about urban renewal and making sure people can afford to stay where they are and that they're not displaced. All of these things are still very much relevant to us today. And so I don't know the answer to that in terms of, I don't know if there are any scholars in the room who have researched politics in Georgia. You have your hand up?
I don't want to say about politics in Georgia, but I did want to point out that Virginia has an amendment on its ballot for this election period to make right to work the law. I mean, an amendment to change our constitution. So if any of you are planning on voting, you haven't had any attention to that in terms of media, but vote against it, please.
Yeah, you know, and this is, I think what's incredible about revisiting the Bond campaign as well is that it emphasizes local and state politics. And so we can get caught up in who's going to be the president, but there's so many other issues. You know, we need to be running candidates. We need to be paying attention to who's being elected to judges, you know, as judges, and what the issues are. And so hopefully it's not too late to have those conversations, but we do have to pay attention to those things. But it is just incredible that those issues are still with us today and that he was talking about them in 1965, 1968.
Other comments on right to work and labor and questions? Oh, yes.
Yeah, well, my name is Chris Prom. I'm with the Institute for Southern Studies, which is a group founded by Julian in 1970. And one of the things is that issue, especially labor, how Julian put labor at the center of the kind of looking forward coming out of the 60s movement about how labor had to be central to the ongoing struggle in the South. And right now there are two states that are putting right to work as constitutional amendments, Virginia and Alabama. And it's already the law in the state. They want to just enshrine it in the Constitution. And that recently happened in Kentucky. And so, but what I think is encouraging is that really you're seeing a kind of new push by labor in southern states that's very much connected to civil rights, immigrant rights, that's trying to really understand that labor can't go it alone. This has to be a broad-based movement, and we've been doing a lot of research and helping groups that are trying to push back on these efforts to pass these constitutional amendments, but also build the groundswell that can eventually realize the vision that Julian had way ahead of his time. A lot of other groups in 1970 have trying to take that out. These were Jim Crow laws. That's important to understand. In the 40s and 50s, they were anti-communist, but also in opposition to the swelling civil rights movement when right-to-work laws were passed. And so really, I think we're at an important moment where we can start to be on the offensive and move forward on that.
Yes, my name is Danielle Robinson, and I have a question more out of curiosity than scholastic. I believe, Professor Levy, you use the term Negro which I haven't heard in many, many moons. And I'm wondering if you simply used it because at that time Professor Bond was doing his work.
Yeah, those were his words. Those were his words. So I was quoting extensively from him.
Oh, okay. Because we did a lot of things.
It's in the back.
Good morning. My name is Russell Logan, UVA alum. I have a question. I was wondering if you guys could speak toward any sort of strategic direction that you might see Black Lives Matter moving in with relationship to SNCC, learnings from SNCC.
One of the things that I think, a couple of things here. When my students ask precisely that question, I ask them, who's the leader of Black Lives Matter? They can't answer that question, right? That's part of Snick's legacy, right? This sort of group-centered approach, right, to leadership. I think one of the other things that Black Lives Matter needs to confront in the future is policy solutions. Howard Moore, who took this case, Bond v. Floyd, to the Supreme Court, who was Professor Bond's brother-in-law, right, was thinking creatively, right, and teaching non-lawyers issues of law. Right? Black Lives Matter needs to develop a vocabulary around things like the Fourth Amendment. I'll give you an example. Trayvon Martin, he was killed by George Zimmerman. George Zimmerman was not a police officer. Right? He was part of Neighborhood Watch. This is about the neoliberal shift in policing. Right? The Fourth Amendment doesn't reach, right, George Zimmerman. You can't ask those kinds of questions about people who are non-state actors. Right? There are more police officers who are not state actors, right, private security guards, right, in this country than police officers. Right? And so the Legal Academy needs to respond to this, right, in the same way that Howard Moore, right, worked with activists on the ground to give them a vocabulary about what's going on with the Fourth Amendment. So I think that these are two sort of takeaways that we might consider.
The other thing I wanted to mention too is that Black Lives Matter activists have been in conversation with SNCC activists. Yes. Charles Cobb is here, Judy Richardson, some others. Julian Bond, very early on, was very supportive of Dream Defenders before Black Lives Matter took off. And so they have been paying attention to that history and have been trying to learn from those gifts that SNCC have given to us, and also challenges. One thing that I think is interesting to look at in terms of Black Lives Matter too is that the organization itself has identified two problems, and that's anti-Black racism and state violence. And then they're concerned about language. I think that's really, it reflects Julian Bond's play with language too. Like he's even telling people to be careful when you say right to work. Julian Bond is always talking about the white problem, that Black politics needs to be organized to solve the white problem, not the Negro problem, not our race problem, but the white problem, pointing to white domination as a problem, as the problem. We see that the white problem is a problem, you know? And so even with just framing the language and being precise in the language, Black Lives Matter has, you know, been very keen on that issue in terms of like, let's call it what it is. Right. Let's talk about anti-Black racism. And I think in that way that you see, I see some parallels there because there's ideological work going on, and Julian Bond was very masterful in understanding how language and ideology is tied to each other, and was always playing with language, you know, saying, he would say like black baiting instead of race baiting, you know, things like that. So it's interesting.
Okay. Yes, sir.
That's my good friend back there.
Is this on this? Yeah. We have one question or one comment on this topic, and then.
Well, you should know that the Snick Legacy project has made a formal statement aligning itself with Black Lives Matter. Visit the website for Snick's One Vote to see what that detailed statement is. we, and I'm a part of the Snick Legacy project, recognize that what's for Woodson and Schwerner, Cheney would have been lost in history. So it's clear that Black Lives Matter, but they haven't been recognized, and Snick knows that.
My name is Brett Scher. In addressing right to work laws, Tasha, you were referring to how important state and local politics is. I think the biggest issue of all in state and local politics right now, really mastered by the Republicans, importantly in 2010, and with the support of the Coke machine. I don't mean Coca-Cola, I mean the other Coke machine. What happened in 2010 was a massive, after the election of Obama in 2008, was a massive effort to get Republicans elected to local office, specifically state legislatures, in time for the redistricting which would come from the 2010 census. And the mess that we're in is really the result of that effort, that there was so much shift in the state legislatures in 2010 that gave the Republicans the power to control the redistricting, and we're stuck at least until 2020, but in 2020, we still have the Republican legislatures that were guaranteed by the redistricting.
Professor
I think that's what
Professor Bond faced a similar kind of problem. Remember, he was elected in the mid-1960s after the reapportionment cases, right? The one-man, one-vote cases that shifted political power from rural districts right back to urban districts. Rural districts had been overrepresented in state legislatures, right? So you have Baker v. Carr, right? Reynolds v. Sims, all of these cases. And he's elected on the heels of that. And then you have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so as blacks are being elected in places like Georgia, you see racial backlash. You see new tactics like disenfranchisement in the state legislature, as Professor Bond experienced, right? That there was a repression that happened because you had new black legislators in the state legislature.
Ms. Klinko?
Hi, my name is Alicia Klinko. I'm actually a student in Professor Sanders' class. And I have a question based on discussions with Snick and the Black Lives Matter movement. And here at the University of Virginia, we're provided with a lot of classes that when we take them, like in Professor Sanders' racial politics class, you are given the ability to have an open forum of conversation with students of different races about Black Lives Matter and about Snick and educating students on the positives of those organizations, including the Black Panther Party. But in other sections of the university and just students in collegiate universities in general, there is an ability to ignore the movement and ignore things that are going on and ignore that conversation. And I was just wondering from the panel, what do you think is the proper way for students in the Black Lives Matter movement and just black students in general and biracial students to expand that conversation and make sure that that conversation is seen by more students than just not even in liberal institutions, but in more engineering and in more different majors? How can we expand that conversation so that it's a university as a whole and not just the black students at the university?
Well, first, buy my book. Because, but actually, the whole point of the book, Racial Justice in Law, is to make it easier for teachers to teach a course. It's designed to fit different approaches, and we're also working on a college-based edition. But ultimately, I think students need to demand courses and other opportunities, bring in speakers and the like, and create those opportunities to discuss things with students and faculty. And if I could also pick up on the Black Lives Matter movement and the earlier question as well, what I would encourage the Black Lives Matter movement to recognize is the importance of who's on courts. So picking up on what Tim said about legal language. Courts were kind of overglorified because of Brown versus Board, and rightly, political action has been increasingly recognized as the key to real social and legal reform. But courts still matter, and they matter quite a lot. We saw the civil rights movement produce things like the Civil Rights Act of '64, Voting Rights 65, Fair Housing Act, and we see the court was an ally in that, upholding the '64 Act. Tim was referring to changes in one man, one vote, the First Amendment ruling for Mr. Bond and the like. So the court was an ally, but of late, over the last few decades, the court has increasingly not just not advanced racial progress, but actually impedes the legal ability of the political process to address inequality. We see it cutting back on the Voting Rights Act, invalidating pre-clearance provision, which was very important to preventing laws from going into effect that inhibit access to voting, striking down majority-minority districts. The disparate impact provisions of the 1964 Act are in serious jeopardy, which have been widely very important in changing policies that have a discriminatory impact. The Fair Housing Act was upheld by a slim margin, but in a very diluted form. And affirmative action and other race-conscious remedies are, again, upheld, but under very diluted form. So the courts are important, not as prime movers, but at least to make sure they don't get in the way. So I encourage us to care about that, and obviously that's an issue in this election, among other reasons, to vote for a candidate who will appoint someone with a more progressive interpretation of the Constitution.
I do want to go back to her question and address it, if I can. I think you're going to have to come to the realization that universities are not designed to support, to cultivate support and interest in social movements. So you're not going to have a widespread university-wide. I'm definitely not at the University of Virginia. And this has been my home, so I can say that. So I think you're going to set yourself up for failure and disappointment if you expect that to happen. But there have to be ongoing conversations, and I would put that on the shoulders of those in student affairs to provide those opportunities. I worked as a director of the Black Cultural Center here under Dean Rick M. Turner right here. We have Dean Terry in the house. It's my crew here. But those that would have been something that we would try to provide ongoing opportunities for students to engage, that to put it on the shoulders of those in the Dean of Students office. Like, it's not the Black students' responsibility. At the same time, if you're looking back at SNCC, those Black students, they dropped out of school to pursue. And I'm not suggesting that, but but that's the reality, I think the other thing is that, you can have these greater opportunities, but just reading recently the essays of Dr. James Turner, who's the founding director of the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University. There's a book, Discourse on Africana Studies, Paradigms of Knowledge. And in one of his essays, he's talking about what he's seeing, the problem within Black student populations is that they're so ready to execute. They're so ready to go towards execution without study and without preparation. And he's saying that what you have to do is that you need to study. You need to take some time to study, okay? We need to take some time to prepare. And then you execute. You can't go straight to execution. And that's part of what we don't have the patience to do that. We're going to always have these issues with the police. We've always had these issues. We're going to always have these issues with state violence. And so, we can't put the pressure. You got to know that, the NAACP took years before they were able to actually organize. These things didn't really happen overnight. And so there's a lot of pressure on Black Lives Matter to deliver when it's just in the infancy. It's in its infancy. It has so much potential power there. It's already so powerful, and there's so much potential power for it to continue to grow, but it's still so young. But we have to study. We have to prepare ourselves, and then we execute. And I think if we're more proactive in that way, instead of putting our energies and always reacting, we're going to be facing this 20 years from now, And so we need to study, and we need to prepare ourselves.
We give Professor Lovelace the last word.
This is an issue that students confronted during my time. during Tasha's time, well
He was
before
my
our time.
student too, so I wanted to take credit for that. As dean. I didn't teach him, but I was a young dean, so I want to
You
say
were
this
the
is my
dean, Dean
my
Levy.
student, yes.
But we must not only put pressure on student affairs, we have to go to the provost too, right?
That's the way to do it.
This is an integral part of this. This university wants to talk about student self-governance as it relates to student affairs. But what about student self-governance as it relates to academic hiring? Right? UVA likes to hold itself out with other prestigious institutions. But you look at the number of Black faculty members here compared to some of these other institutions, right? Exactly, right? Woodson just became a department, right? And so take from Snick, right? Use your body, put your body on the line, make a claim to this university, right? In the provost's office, right? At the president's office, right? To tarnish the image of the university if that's what it takes, right? Hopefully that's not what it takes, but history has told us that, right? And so pulling from Snick and that legacy will give you, right, a blueprint for how to engage in struggle on college campuses.
I'm so, okay.
Next, I ask you to call it to a halt. I want to say, yeah, we want to try to keep the buses running, and now we're making us late. Another thing I think in response to that question is because these issues are confronted and must be confronted as all other issues involving social change historically in multi-pronged ways, all right? And so students have significant amount of power. One of the points of power that you have, or the levers of power that you have, that you don't exercise to the extent that you could, is to be in the courses that are offered to you, all right? To be in the hall where symposia have been organized for a year, where you are receiving information that can explode your brain. This is what you can, these things you can do. When you want to agitate for more faculty, you have to be in the classes. You have to take the classes. You have to take classes beyond the first level. You have to take classes not for grades. So basically, I just want you to be aware of the power that rests in you. Yes. Taking courses isn't a solution. There is no this is no panacea. But you want to avail yourselves of all the opportunities you have to be informed about the issues that matter to you and matter to our university, to the Republic. I would agree with Tasha. Universities are bastions of conservatism. They are in the business to preserve themselves exactly as they are, with as little change as they can make. But you have to do what you can do within these parameters. Universities are not places that are ultimately transformative. That you just need to understand.